As we go.
Yeah, that's what she put in. All right. Well, it is 6:01 and we'll go ahead and get started. This is most everybody who we're expecting tonight based on RSVPs. Thank you for coming to the second meeting of the Lawrence Bikes Plan Update Steering Committee meeting. We can hopefully you had a chance before we met. We got you as much stuff as we could as early in advance, so you had an opportunity to look through it. We're gonna do some presentation and kind of walk through of the content that we have tonight, and hopefully have some discussions with you. We've got a few questions on the survey too, and some of these things, so we can talk about where we're at in the data collection phase, and then talk about what's next in our continued engagement and kind of next steps that we envision to work with you. So I'm gonna turn it over to Adia to begin our process to kind of walk through the public engagement survey. And that is, I have a paper copy for those of you who want to take notes on it or have it for your reference tonight for tonight's discussion.
Okay. So, our first phase of public engagement is over. We ran it from March to early May. And with that was our first survey, which you guys have all seen, and hopefully you took it. We got 581 responses. Along with that, we also had one open house and we had a handful of tabling opportunities. So I'm gonna jump into the survey responses, and if at any point, you guys have any thoughts or you had something you wanted to talk about one of the questions, just feel free to interrupt me, just jump in. So, yeah, we started off asking the community members what their primary mode of transportation was, and no surprise, the bulk was car, but the second most was bicycle. We also found out that most users ride their bicycle a few times a week or daily. And the primary reason for cycling was for exercise and health, but this two-way tie is between to get to school and for fun. We also had some other responses on that question, and so you guys can read through that. Got health, barriers, social, economic, and environment. We also asked if we had any e-bike users or plus users. The majority said no. We did have a small percentage say that they rode small lightweight vehicles. The majority of those were skateboards and scooters. Oh. No, this one. Oh.
So
Oh my gosh.
just click over on the PDF.
Okay.
So if you hover over the weather report, it gives you all the news.
You don't like to forget too much. You're right.
And with those responses, those are not additive. You could have an e-bike and a small device. You can answer yes to both of those.
So, Jessica, do you want to explain this one a little bit?
So in bicycle planning, kind of from the League of American Bicyclists, there's really some different user groups that they classify as different rider types. And so that's enthused and confident, interested but concerned, or strong and fearless, or just not interested in that space. But of the three kind of bike types, that really talks about all ages and abilities and where people are in those spaces. And so I think probably for the most sense, you know, the strong and fearless is a rider who's going to ride anywhere, regardless of if their facilities, all the way to, you know, I'm interested, but I'm going to be really careful where I ride because I'm concerned. I would ride maybe more, but if I felt safer. And then, enthused and confident, I enjoy and feel comfortable on streets when they have infrastructure or there's slower speeds. And so these categories, it's interesting because people self-identify with these based on these descriptions, but I think it starts to begin the look at how we're correlating what infrastructure is present versus people's comfort on the types of places that they're biking, and this tells the story. So it's, you know, the majority in this case of respondents, or the largest selection, said really I enjoy riding, but I feel comfortable on these types of where there's infrastructure or neighborhood streets. And then the second batch is I only use facilities with major separation, which I think Jenny goes back to that group you were really hoping to hear from in the survey responses and to see, which is people who really are using loop or shared use path infrastructure, but not really venturing out more in that space because of concerns. And then strong and fearless in that space is maybe many of you are friends that you have in the space where you're riding, you're using infrastructure. Of course, you may want other designated facilities, but you're going to get there to get where you want to go and find what's available in those spaces because you're strong and fearless. So this is just kind of a, it's people are self-identifying, but it kind of gives us an idea about what type of cyclist, maybe of that bicycler who was responding to these, this question that we ask in the survey in terms of, it's the first point, I think, where you can start to gauge and understand who we're hearing from, what type of cyclists.
So we also wanted to know how people feel on busier commercial streets. So if you look at the graph there, you can see that the majority of people feel safest when there's a protected bike lane. And then it kind of goes back to no designated facilities at all. So the more separated, the better.
I'm just making it so you can see the legend at least.
And then we also asked how comfortable people feel on neighborhood streets. And it was a pretty even batch across. So nothing really jumps out with these numbers.
So these are kind of interesting because we look at them as staff, and in the cases where we had infrastructure, we tried to give people pictures in the visual preference survey that were things they would recognize. That can both be good or bad, because people can have had an experience in that space or know something additional about it that leads them to say one thing or other about comfort. But we feel like it's still better in that space to know that than to just show random pictures where you're judging something based on no contextual understanding, maybe in some of those spaces to see a picture. And we tried to find pictures that all showed cyclists in them, because I think that also matters in terms of how people position themselves or to use those infrastructure things. But anything surprising in either of those charts that for anyone in terms of comfort? So the one thing I would say, and I observed in this, is it's interesting to me because bicycle boulevards are a specific brand where a street has traffic calming, but then it's also with preference to bicycles, right? So streets with traffic calming in some case could also be bicycle boulevards, but it's how you brand it, because some communities brand it as neighborhood greenways or just do traffic calming in places that then makes the street more comfortable for bikes. But I was just kind of interested in, and I think overall based on that, very comfortable and somewhat comfortable, they're kind of in the same range. But I was just interested a little bit in that. I just thought that was very interesting that people, when it had the brand of bicycle boulevard in that space, that the comfort perception was higher and or in the picture we showed there versus just even streets with traffic calming, because there's a lot more streets, I think, in the community and some of the other efforts around neighborhood traffic management where there's additional efforts with traffic calming that then impact how the street may feel, but isn't necessarily targeted, to just bicycle throughput. That's one observation like I made when I was looking at this.
I think some of that comfort level around town depends on which bicycle boulevard you're talking about. Some of them are definitely more comfortable to use than others.
Sure. Yeah, and we'll see later in the survey, the bicycle boulevard on 21st gets called out a lot as being uncomfortable. So it really does vary on where it is for community members. So the next thing we wanted to know was how comfortable people felt on shared use paths, and no surprise, most people felt very comfortable. Very small percentage felt very uncomfortable. So,
and those are ones separated from traffic. So I think that's going to be a lot of your loop type amenities and the stuff through parks or natural green spaces, which is consistent with what we've heard in all sorts of planning around multimodal users.
Do you have any comments on what they made them feel uncomfortable? Like safety, since there's no traffic on there.
I don't think there was a space in that space to talk about it. So you
Remember, yeah.
even the things, I would just say anecdotally, the things we've heard before is just like personal safety things
That's what I was kind of thinking.
around who else is on the trail and or crime, or just like, like, is there lighting or those other things? That's what I would assume, but again, there wasn't.
That's what I was
a spot
assuming
to-
too.
Yeah,
I would think intersections would be a big one too.
crossings.
Yeah.
I try to use some charities passing more because the intersections just can't get across safely. So,
But this question's asking specific from those separated from traffic. So there are crossings, but there's probably fewer crossings in those spaces, which is why the comfort level is so probably a lot higher than the comfort level in like on a commercial street where you have a shared use path adjacent to the roadway, like the Clinton Parkways or Sixth Street or Castle type spaces.
So we also asked about comfort on some specific improvements that we've made. So we asked about the 21st Street Bicycle Boulevard. We asked about the Lawrence Loop Tunnel. And we also asked about buffered bike lanes and bike boxes on Massachusetts and 11th to 15th. And this is where you can see the numbers do kind of change on the Bicycle Boulevard. You can see some discomfort starts to come through. But most people are really comfortable on the loop, so.
That's my favorite tunnel.
Yeah. So in the previous bike lane, we had asked both of the previous questions where it talks about comfort on different types of facilities. We hadn't asked a question that talked about specific facilities here, so that's kind of interesting. And you can go back and compare those, I think, to the like bicycle boulevards above had a higher comfort level in general. But then when you come to a specific bicycle boulevard, it had lower, very comfortable, somewhat comfortable, but it also had a higher percent of people say don't know or no response. So maybe they hadn't experienced it, and that's kind of the shift. But that's just also kind of interesting when you think about those comfort levels.
I was surprised, like doing some of the tabling also. Pretty much any tabling event, there was at least one person that asked for clarification on where this McDonald tunnel was. And oh, well, okay, yeah, I've ridden it once, or they, might still cut up along, that'd be North Iowa there. So that was an interesting response to it and led to a few more don't knows than some of the other facilities.
I have a dumb question. Where is another bike boulevard besides 21st Street?
There are no other designated bike boulevards in
Right,
Lawrence
yeah.
besides that. I think you're
Good, 'cause
referring
I
to
was
other
like-
streets that are future bike boulevards or
Well,
that
there's
use
streets that
or
have-
signed
that
as
are-
bike routes.
restricted to cars going in one direction. Like you only
Yeah.
cars can exit that
So like
road and no
Swartz,
cars can.
Swartz, or
and
Rhode Island.
Rhode Island.
Yes, but I don't-
And
but I
then
think-
also, is it Vermont? That's
yes. So
Oh,
a
okay.
lot of those streets, and this is the little bit, just a nuance in that difference. Well, yes, they do allow for bikes. They aren't designed as bike boulevards. They've just used techniques to restrict automobile traffic, but then permitted bicycle traffic. So in the same sense, like where the bike boulevard project was designed and built as a bike boulevard, they probably do traffic calming, but they haven't been branded as bike boulevard.
modal filters.
Yeah, it's just, and really mostly it was because people wanted to restrict cars. It was traffic calming, but then they said, oh, but it really wouldn't hurt if we allowed bikes. And those, almost all of those came about 5 to 10 years before the bike boulevard did, probably. Most of them, not all of them, but they're vehicle motivated. So I don't know if that changes how that's interesting that you say in that sense, you know what I mean? If there's some design elements that change the perspective of some of those things.
Well, it's if 21st Street is the only bicycle boulevard. When you answer a question about bicycle boulevards in general, make me feel more safe, but that one right there, it's not as safe. And that's kind of a takeaway from it too. The one on 21st Street, I see that having the least amount of very comfortable riders. And
Yeah, but it's
That
only,
is a-
it's like, I don't know how much percent different, 5 to
well,
5% different.
49% to 64%, that's 15% different, and I think, and only 49%.
Boulevards is like, sorry, you're good.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
62% to,
Okay. Yeah, I didn't look at.
yeah, 49. But the increase in that space, 25, sorry, I was gonna go back and
Yeah.
look at the percentage.
When you actually ride on it, you discover you have to avoid cars a lot more often than you do in another environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can read about some of the causation and why people say
Yeah.
that they're unsafe in that space. I think that's what you're speaking to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that even with, you know, the first question, we had a large percentage of people who a car was their main mode of transportation. But I think just from experience with this survey and this type of project, we're hitting more cyclists in general, and probably cyclists who have seen things like bike boulevards in other communities. So when we ask those general questions, locally, yes, they've got 21st Street as their only reference, but I think, you know, a lot of the people that are responding have experienced bike boulevards elsewhere or have seen other research about it.
And they know those, I mean, I'm not a fan of the 21st Street Bike Boulevard and the other bike boulevards, you either have, I mean, if you've never ridden on it, the concept is really good. After having ridden on 21st Street and having ridden on bike boulevards in other cities, the 21st Street is,
Well, they're
Not
not all
good.
equal, right? There's a design
There's a lot,
toolbox
right.
that gives you a lot of options that you can deploy along a bicycle boulevard to either restrict or slow traffic.
right,
That bicycle boulevard, through the design process it went through with neighbors, chose some of those tools, not all of them. And I would say also, like, well, the ones they chose, that was also probably value engineered in that space, that some of the things with the budget ended up getting dropped from the project that would have maybe slowed or impacted traffic more in some of that space. But I think you're right, that that's part of the design. When you get into a specific design overall, there's a lot of picking and choosing, and each in those public processes, when you're working with direct property owners and neighbors,
yeah,
that influences what happens in that space to the final project design. And that's the space where if we realize there is something we didn't like in one, we have to learn from that to iterate
Right.
differently.
and the ones I've seen in other cities are in grid structured streets that are not on through streets, and Lawrence doesn't have that many through streets, so when you find one, cars take it and bikes take it, and 21st Street is more of a through street, and therefore, and there aren't that many access points, and in a traditional grid setup, you've got every block, you've got intersections, and 21st Street isn't like that, and so you have to,
But it did in terms of slowing traffic, slow traffic, and then we have some before and after counts that we can
yeah.
bring
That's good.
back to you if you want to see
Good.
those. It did the result of slowing traffic in that space and prioritizing lowered volumes and slowed traffic. So in that case, when you look at the metrics from the engineering perspective, it was still effective, but it's obviously not effective enough if people's experience riding it isn't the level of comfort we desire.
Right.
So I think that this type of information can inform us to share with the engineers when we're doing design in that space. The unintended consequence maybe of putting in like the chicanes that they did, where people are then forced into the lane with the space, which is what I think we heard a lot of in the comments, that didn't feel as safe to somebody maybe as a dip or a hump would, which would also maybe slow traffic, but still give you a space. Yeah, so,
Jimmy, go ahead.
yeah, and Stephen can look that up, but also we can bring that back to you in the future, because we just got those from our engineers.
So coupled with this question, we also gave people an opportunity to kind of expand on why certain facilities that we had called out in this question maybe were uncomfortable or comfortable. And we sorted them into alike categories, so it'll make it easier to read for you guys. So one of our categories was bike infrastructure. And I'll let you guys read through these. I'm sure most of you have. One thing that really stood out to me is this is where you can see 21st gets called out in a lot of comments. Some of them say this one says it's the most comfortable. Some of them say they're not comfortable, so it's kind of a mixed bag. So. Lots of 21st. And there's a lot to read through. We include every word response when we give it to you guys, so. All 580.
I think the key in that for you though is really to see there's some common themes that pop up around different types of things. And then there is really everything on the spectrum. From don't do anything more, don't spend money on this, to build everything everywhere. And I think that our role in this space, hopefully, and why we provide you all of this is to see the context of the responses from our community and people who engaged with us around the sentiment in this space, so we can understand how this can inform some of the recommendations around whether that's comfort or network or other program policy recommendations in this space, so.
Also, had a category for safety concerns, so. This is where we got some more specific comments about 21st Street, where. People called out the traffic calming that was used and how it's not as desirable to them. They also called out, just feelings of, being unsafe around cars, car speeds, traffic volume. Things of that nature. A lot of comments about Lawrence Loop, mostly positive. A lot of people just want it closed. A lot of people primarily use it. So lots of good things about Lawrence Loop. This one says in all caps, finish the loop. So we're working on it. Another category was community awareness. So we found that a lot of community members really feel like there's a need for more education surrounding how drivers and cyclists should interact when they're on the road together. Just something I'm sure you guys have all heard and maybe even felt. So we got a few comments about that. The public has not been educated about our bike usage, increasing public knowledge, having clear and concise signage. So all of those things are extremely important. And then just some general support. So these are just some positive comments, people who like what we're up to. And then some opposition and trade-offs. So these are some comments mostly against bike planning, and or maybe people who don't necessarily see the use. And then we've got our general comments. These were ones that didn't really have anything to do with plan.
Or we couldn't determine where they.
Yeah, we couldn't determine where to put them, like Steve.
That is always a little bit of a challenge with, we always, for accessibility, we always want paper surveys. I would bring those to our public meetings, things like that. But I don't stand over your shoulder while you fill those out. So occasionally we will have notes in the margins, which we typically end up adding to the general comment section.
Yeah. We also had some,
Or
some
because we are city affiliated and we hear things about all sorts of
other
other
city things that
things
we're not
happening.
doing here. Yeah. And then maintenance and operations, we had a few comments about debris in the bikeways, and I thought it was important to kind of take those out and put them in their own section, just so we can be mindful.
But we do want to point out to all of you that the city of Lawrence has Lawrence C-Click Fix. And you can go report street debris that needs to be cleaned up. That's one of the categories. So if you're not already doing that and you see that on the street, that's a tool you should be using. I mean, we can hear about it in this, but the best way to get it addressed is by using the Lawrence C-Click Fix app. If you see a traffic sign down, if the street light's out, if there's any other, tree branch across the trail or roadway, any type of issues like that, there's a whole category of issues that you can submit comments on, and that's the most appropriate way to get some responses in those.
And when you
spaces.
take a picture with your phone, then it tells them right where it is.
Yes, and they particularly appreciate that because they can see the nature of what you're talking about, rather than sometimes somebody may move something and they're going out looking for it, like, where are you, based on where you dropped the pin, Potholes is another, if there's something there's a pothole option for repairs, and they're pretty responsive to those. Those come in as work orders in the system, and so it allows them to process those in their workflow for the crews that are appropriate based on the issue. So just if you all didn't know that, you should know that, and that's something that also I think the better job of cleaning that sometimes is there's not a city staff member always out looking at that, but if they get reports, that's something they address. in a
And
timely
back to them
fashion.
after they fix it. I've submitted a ticket before.
Yeah, and was it responsive?
May I ask, did you, while tabling, did you encounter any, or did people express any opinions or share thoughts that aren't represented here?
So oftentimes, sometimes people are talking to us and asking questions about
Yeah.
stuff. And that's normally the conversations we have. And then sometimes they may get their question answered. And they say, okay, yeah, I want to take the survey, or no, I don't. And we really encourage them to use the survey tool, because this isn't, talking to us isn't a representation of that. But most of the people we talk to in a lot of the tabling opportunities, particularly like when we're tabling at like the trails event, a lot of people had already seen and taken the survey. Looks good. So the conversations we were having are like, what are your next steps? Explain this. We had a poster with level of comfort talk to us about this, and just do more education in general, which I think is kind of just valuable to the process. But no, we try not to do that. If there is something, what we'll do, and somebody has something, but they don't want to take the time to write it, oftentimes we will turn it over when they're there standing with us and say, okay, I'm gonna write this sentence down based on what you said, and we put it in our thing. So they may not have answered the whole survey, they may just have we put a comment in, that's something like that. If it's something that's like, I'm not gonna take your survey, but this, and it's relevant to our work, then we do that.
Regarding the community awareness and education, was it a part of the last bicycle plan, the video series that was produced to be shown at city meetings?
Yeah, so one of the things we did is the elements in the last bikeway plan, and because at that time we had a videographer at the city that was a newer position working with us in that space, we worked with volunteers to write the Lawrence in Year series. Does everybody know what Jared's talking about in that space? Some of you were in our videos, Catherine,
My children.
Jared, yes. But there's on YouTube, you can look it up on Lawrence on YouTube, and there's a Lawrence in Year series that was supposed to be an educational series about different ways how you route on a bicycle, 3-foot passing. There's 4 or 5 of them. And they played for a while before commission meetings, and then I think they kind of phased those out at some point when either we weren't going
Illegal
on TV
courtesies.
anymore. What?
Illegal courtesies.
Illegal
was a big
courtesies,
one.
yes, thank you. I just couldn't remember all that. There was 4 or 5.
Pushing
Yeah.
people way
Were there any surprises to you guys?
Right.
Familiar with this? Did it just reinforce what you already know, or did it open your eyes to some things?
I think the Bike Boulevard thing was surprising, where you talk about the tools we used in the Bike Boulevard, where people said, yes, no, they're really comfortable. And then a lot of comments about them. I think I think there's some stuff we can learn there in the design based on that project.
Were you?
I think overall though, it's similar probably to common themes we hear in this space, or like we would have heard in the last plan. There's probably some nuance and shift in, one-off comments that we hear in that space. Stephen, was there anything surprising?
No, I think it is always just interesting to see the variety. And I try to look at, when you look at the whole spreadsheet laid out, what level of confidence did this person identify with, and then how did they answer the questions. But 21st Street, I think again, there's some very interesting points in there about what tools we used, how that develops. I think some of that falls back to education, and both for cyclists and drivers, and how to best push that out. But a lot of it was confirmation of the things that people are already telling us.
And as practitioners, I think we're starting to think about solutions. Do you know what I mean? When I hear a lot of this, I started thinking like, okay, education, enforcement, like what type of solutions can we create, think about that. Not only can we recommend in a plan, but that are going to be politically viable in that space. Because the other thing that I think always that comes across in these surveys is that resident expectations are often a lot of times very much higher than what there's fiscal capacity and political willpower for. And in this space particularly, and so that's thinking about it more, it's trying to figure out those bits, and I think we're gonna work with you to try to come up with a plan.
Does this group have a role in advocating for the Lawrence Loop?
not officially, this group really is set up and established to guide this planning process and document. And then at the end, you all go back to your homes. The group exists for plan development. So I think there are other nonprofits in the community that are advocating, like Friends of Lawrence Area Trails, who is a representative party on this body, but they're one of many perspectives in this
I'd like
space.
to check in with you. The other thing that I guess the thing that most surprised me were the demographics of the age group. I mean, this is like 40% of the people who responded were 55. And when you look at that, 20% were 65 or under. I mean, that says something about, when we think about, I don't know, design, and whether that is relevant or not, but that certainly surprised me.
Yeah, I think we were amused, we keep an eye on as the surveys as they come in, the numbers, keeping track of that. And we'd see things like 12 surveys coming in an hour. It was like, oh, that must have been one of the high school classes that we reached out to. And no, it was almost always must have been a civic group or something. Because we did have some high school responses. We reached out to teachers at both high schools. But yeah, it did have some. We're certainly hearing from certain kind of older or adult groups more than we were getting to some of those younger populations. And some of that, I think we'll mention it later, it's kind of upcoming things, but we're still working on interactions with the universities, getting to that group a little more directly instead of the community-wide survey, working directly with students, staff, and faculty. So trying to get all those perspectives, but I think the demographics here, yeah, show us something.
Do you have a sense of how representative this is of the overall community? So question 2, only 8% never ride a bike. Like I would guess that's closer to like 50 or 60% of the population never rides a bike, even in good weather. But do you just have a?
We don't,
a
not
sense
for
of
that one, we don't have, but I think,
I mean, overall, like.
I mean, you're right. I think in general, this is a self-selected survey. So we know in general, we're hearing from people who are often on either end of the spectrum. They either are advocates and in this space, probably where they ride a bike, they own a bike, they want to ride a bike. And then you see in the survey, people who are absolutely opposed and anti-bike in that space, and we get some of those responses. And I think that probably that interest and concern versus some of those other spaces kind of starts to tell us how many of those people are, in those spaces about whether or not we're in that. But I mean, this is, I don't know, 500 may not sound like a lot to you, but it's quite a lot of effort to get 500 responses. So that's actually a really decent response rate for this type of planning process and survey. And some of our longer range planning surveys were like 18 months. We'll be lucky to get like, I think 2 plans ago, we had one that had like 1,600 responses. And that's the most I've ever had over, an 18-month period for a big planning process for this type of engagement and a survey. So I feel like in general, are there some groups we're missing? Probably yes. And we're going to try to ferret some of that out through some of the focus group stuff we're going to talk about on some of these more niche issues. And then with our university work and doing some engagement with the student, faculty, staff kind of in those spaces, we're going to try to figure out how we can hear some a little bit more from those populations, which I think are largely underrepresented based on just the age demographic alone.
I actually don't mind that they're not in here. I'm just trying to imagine like this is a subset of the overall community that cares one way or another about biking. And maybe there's this whole other group that doesn't have a feeling on it one way or another. But I think those are the people you need to reach, are the people. But I'm just trying to imagine like what portion of the whole community is this?
Well, I think it's also interesting to think about people's relationships to cycling. So I think the first thing that we think about is people who are biking. But in tabling, especially at some of our more community events, like down at the library or at the yard sale, I had people that specifically, they filled it out and like, know, I don't ride at all, but my grandkids ride and I care about their safety. And so, you know, it's a view of safety that might not necessarily be developed from the bike, you know, from the saddle. But it is people who care, and still want to see improvements to, cycling. I think another thing that kind of came up as far as who do we reach? Don't know that we got a lot of extra survey responses per se. But especially, again, library, it's always an interesting place to table. But you would see people starting to disengage, oh, bikes, but we're doing bikes plus, how do you feel about e-scooter? Oh, I've got opinions on e-scooter. And so we did hear a little bit more about, you know, from that, even if it didn't always result in a survey response. But I think it did kind of get people a little more, oh yeah, that makes sense, so they're all sharing space, and brought out some people's just comments on pedestrians as well.
I mean, when you talk about surprises, I think this is always interesting, and we look back to things we've heard in other plans and processes having been here, or other community like the Parks and Rec plan, where they did the statistically valid survey, and you know, the top need that people felt like that investment should be made in is like biking and walking trails, you know, and that comes out at the very top. And so I think even though you're talking about where do people care, they did a very, like for the Parks and Rec master planning process, they did the statistically valid survey where you find it's not only they care, that's what people say is that should be the top Parks and Rec kind of need and issue in that space. And so I think you see some of that in this, which you may just get a different grouping of people than what's, you know, in a statistically valid survey, but that there's, you know, that there's community-wide interest and support. It's about the nuances of what types of elements you're talking about in that space.
So you can see that a lot of people answered that the thing that prevents them from bicycling more is careless or speeding drivers. And then coming in second is gaps to particular bike lanes. That was another one when we opened it up to additional comments. And we broke it into categories. We have safety concerns. We've got some comments about unprotected bike lanes. Concerns about children being on unprotected routes. Infrastructure issues, brick streets are bumpy, sidewalks are narrow.
That gives you some insight about where maybe people are riding, because those types of, you know, like, brick streets exist in a predominant one area of the community.
And then some personal preferences and just other responses. And yeah, we got to our demographics.
What is the standard dimensions of a bike lane? And I ask because I know other cities that have wider bike lanes, like in Colorado or.
It's changed over time.
Has it?
Yes.
I know
And
bike
so-
lanes that are just as large as the vehicle lane,
Yes,
right?
and so that's probably part of what you see in our community is that many of the bike lanes are retrofit projects, which with engineering judgment have been built less than the standard.
Okay.
And I think that's probably part of the public sentiment around bike lanes in our community is that the majority of the lane miles we have are probably in the 4 to 5 foot range, and some of the newer recommended standards are 5 to 6 foot plus. I think some of that in terms of volume you're seeing, or maybe they have a buffer, you know, they have a 2 or 3 foot buffer or the median and then the bike lane too, which now you're talking, you know, you maybe have 6 feet, you got curb and gutter, whether or not that's included in your design, and then your, whatever your infrastructure is, you could be up to 10 to 11 foot, which is what an auto, you know, which is in our design specs for auto lanes.
Sure.
But it has changed over time, and there are some standards, like if you're building it new, here's your standard you're building to, and then there's oftentimes in the space that we get into, which was particularly retrofits, when you're not rebuilding streets, there's engineering judgment in that.
Okay.
So.
Okay.
And I would say probably a lot of the ones we hear about or that people talk about riding on are on the narrower side.
I'm not sure how many times it came up here, but I know that we personally hear a lot about 19th, which is one of those smaller examples.
You know, I'm just curious, but it might be interesting for us if we actually had an engineer who's,
We do.
Well, I'm looking
Because-
at, while you asked that question, I was
Yeah.
looking up, we got we're working with a consultant, Track Design Group on Mass Street multimodal. And they recently looked up the standards for bike lanes between two vertical constraints because that is intended with the multimodal 14th to 23rd project to be buffered by a median. So it'd be between the curb and the physical median. And the standards have changed since we went to community engagement. There was a recent release of ASHTO and NACTO. So minimum bike lane width 4 feet per ASHTO for division. I didn't study in a lot of detail because they came up with a recommendation that we agreed with, and we were constrained in that particular case by.
But the reality is they're changing. Like as we speak or as we do our duty projects over the decades, right? They're changing. And we can look, we can look in Lawrence, in our existing bikeway plan, we have a design guidance that links to the design guidance documents that Aaron's talking about, which is the ASHTO Green Book. And then NACTO, which is National Association of Transportation Professionals. They have what's perceived as the more progressive, all ages, kind of more city oriented for urban bikeway design guidelines. And there's 2 standards. Our street design standards recognize and acknowledge both of those guiding documents. So we can design under either one of them. And a lot of that, then there's a lot of flexibility, I think, even within engineering judgment of that in those guiding documents of those spaces.
They take into account with the rest of I'm thinking of 19th Street. And your bike lanes are narrow in some places, but also your car lanes are narrow, so the whole street was crowded.
Yeah. And so in retrofit situations, there's like minimum, there's minimum requirements for some of those painting of lines, which if you're designing a roadway, you're probably not in a new roadway, you're not building it to often those like very, very, very minimums, you're just building it to design specs, right? But in a lot of those retrofit spaces, if we're not rebuilding the curb, then you're trying to fit in existing space, whether that's street lanes, turning lanes, parking, you're having all these conflicts of user types in that space, and it's a negotiation for that space. But there is additional guidance, like Aaron said, when there's, if you have a curb and then like a concrete median in some of those spaces. We can look all those up and bring those back in conversation. Although, ultimately, I think the question really becomes about, and we'll need to talk about some of those things in the comfort level scale that we have, which we'll hope to show you some of next time, how this relates to how we've heard about comfort, but then how that relates to what we're recommending in that comfort space, because we have in the existing plan, the goal about level of comfort 3 or below. And in that, there's a chart that talks about speed and volume. That's also applicable to those comfort levels then. So specific design is one part of that, but really within the parameters of speed and volume, there's also considerations of that space, I think, to comfort back to design too.
But there's some streets just should not have bike lanes.
So,
Because there's no way to make it safe for cars.
so that is a huge trade-off question we're gonna have to grapple with. And I think not everybody's on the same page about that. And it's the idea is if you can't design to this ideal standard in your retrofit or maintenance project, that you do nothing and then wait. And the reality of that with the fiscal reality of the situation is that means nothing may be done for 20 to 30 plus years.
Yeah, and I don't mean that you're not gonna have bike lanes, you're just gonna say this street isn't gonna have it, our next one over my. Bike track.
Sure. But I think that's not usually the scenario that we get into.
Right.
The scenario we usually get into is we're doing street maintenance on this street with a street maintenance project. We can do lane reconfiguration and add painted white stripe bike lane, the striped bike lanes, a conventional bike lane. When we do the maintenance project, because we're not rebuilding the street. And within this complete streets policy, it says, look at all the mode user choices. And it's the question of not that there's any parallel streets, other streets. It's in this question of, do you do this at this time? And I think it depends really the nature of the cyclist that you ask about what that solution should be. Some would say, do nothing. No, I'm not going to ride in that. It's not going to matter. And probably more strong and fearless would say, no, it gives me a protected space. Cars expect me there. And that space, and it's on that spectrum, and I think every time, the way that's happening now is previously the Multimodal Transportation Commission, or now the Connected City Committee, is gonna be faced with that each opportunity when they look at the street maintenance plan to make that decision. The current bikeway plan says, do the next best thing in lieu of nothing. And I think that this plan is gonna have to go back and evaluate again in that space, like we're gonna have to say, is that still the option, that we should leave the option open to these type of guiding committees? Or you say, no, if it doesn't meet this minimum thing of design comfort, we're not gonna do it at all. And I think that's gonna be those are the harder decisions to make, because you're in a fiscal situation where the street maintenance budget can pay for pavement markings.
Right.
And the fiscal reality of residents' expectations is very high for both the type of infrastructure they would like and the cost of that increasing separation of infrastructure versus available resources and how fast they would like to see that implemented and deployed. So oftentimes in that space, without increasing the available money for projects or available grant, whether that's grant resources or local dollars, you're not going to get more higher separation of infrastructure without increasing budgets at the same pace. You're gonna either slow your roll, you're gonna slow the roll of time that it takes you to deploy the network, or you're gonna, and do the highest first only, or you're gonna have to increase the resources allocated to that space. And those are the trade-offs in this space, and the plan can represent some of the we're gonna need to have conversation about some of those nuanced situations to try to decide what type of policy statement the plan should guide future advisory bodies and decision makers in. So those are things we're gonna have to think about.
Do you have any data, sorry, to help guide those questions? Because I feel like my 10-year-old sees the bike lane on 19th and would feel comfortable riding in. I would say, no, you're not allowed to ride there because it's not safe.
Yeah, they're conflicting studies. Yes, we could bring you studies on probably in a lot of those spaces, and they're not always all the same. They may say exact opposite things. And I think that's the challenge.
That was kind of my point, is that even though I perceive the 21st Street bicycle to be not as safe as
Yeah.
other things, these standards are based on statistics and true safety measures, and your comeback that it's been proven that it's slowed traffic, and there's
Well,
statistics that
based on the
support that.
data, we can show
And
that,
that
yeah.
can impact my perception, but if you don't have any data
Sure.
to support that,
Sure.
then
Sure.
I'll be more skeptical. So
Sure. We do, and we'll bring that back. I made a note of that. We'll bring that back and
Oh,
talk about those
yeah.
things, and we can talk about some different conflicting values in those spaces, and I think that's part of the challenge is not all decisions are the same, right? There's context, there's neighborhood context, and when we get into design of those projects, there's adjacent property owner context in some of those spaces. There's, the larger network goals around connectivity, and depending on your whole street network layout, or whether or not you have grid or curvilinear style street development, and what options you have for, like if you have a grid, there may be lots of options you could have where you're talking about, Catherine, can we put the bike lane on one street versus another? Or whatever, there's conflicts with parking in a lot of spaces and those trade-offs, and politically, that's not always been very viable to remove parking in a lot of projects and instead to install the bikeway, and so those are other trade-offs that we experience, and so I think we have to think about all of those things as we decide what the plan should recommend in terms of facility types that we feel are acceptable to continue to address the concerns that we're hearing from the community. I think also it'll be interesting to see, this is why when we did our first open house, and you can go back and look at this map, is go back and look at them. This may be just an interesting exercise. Go back and look at the map of the things that we showed that have been built since the last bike plan. Because I think prior to the last bike plan, we didn't have this guidance about level of comfort. So there's been a very short time frame, 5 years basically, where these new guidances have been in effect. So 19th Street bike lanes already existed before that. If people are still talking to us about those, that's not under the new guidance. Maybe or maybe not, those would have been built in the new guidance, right? And so I think we have to think about, that may be also just an interesting exercise to think about, like, what we, since we've set these standards the last times, are we getting more comfortable things than we did before? Yes. Okay, one. Two, is it enough based on what we've heard and what we expect at a level of comfort, yes or no? And that we can shift the guidance in that space. And then third is just, once it goes to implementation, what's the political and fiscal reality of whatever we're recommending? Because the reality is we can't afford as a community to reconstruct everything at once. And so you're seeing incremental pieces over time, which is, even since the last plan was the first time that we had a priority and secondary network and dedicated funding to build bike and ped infrastructure. And so you're starting to see, like, the 9th Street project or some of the loop segments or the Mass Street project, where identified projects in the plan are starting to be implemented as, standalone or other bikeways based on those priority recommendations to kind of complete these, what we call primary and secondary networks, in addition to just projects at large that are happening as part of the Complete Streets policy. So those are some other just nuances of how we have to think about how bikeways get constructed in our community. And if there needs to be process improvement in those spaces, that we're not getting what we wish for out of the existing processes. And so this conversation, hopefully you can tell my mind is working to think about, you pose me with these challenges and questions. We're gonna bring back the data and information that we can to you in this conversation, so we can all work together to make logical decisions. And it's our goal to hopefully hear what you have to say in that space and to try to think about how the processes and things that we are doing are gonna impact the outcomes. And we'll hopefully guide some recommendations
How
in
much
that
influence
space.
do we have on future projects? So as they're expanding or building new neighborhoods and putting in streets, how much can they build streets to be bike friendly to begin with, so that we are not having to come in and. fit
So
things in?
part of that is land development code influence. Second part of that is subdivision regulation influenced. And I think we're moving in a good direction, but more work will still have to be done in that space. But for example, there have been instances when development has occurred, you're seeing the response of developers to those community desires. I mean, when Menards was put in, the connection of Naismith Valley Trail down to the loop, that was a developer funded segment, right? So I think, and you'll see in some of the, in some, I'm not going to speak to specific proposals, but we've seen in some development proposals, additional call outs for shared use path and other elements of connections to especially when it connects to existing infrastructure. Could it be stronger? Yes. And I think there are probably some elements in that as those regulations change, or there's those processes that update some of those things, there will be opportunities, I think, for people to advocate and weigh in those spaces. But we can call some of those out in the plan as recommendations. It's not easy. I think you see that, hopefully you can see that perspective in this space that, we're hearing from people on all ends of the spectrum and navigating with constraint. And so we're going to continue to do that in a way that we can based on the best information we have. And the valuable part in this process is the MPO and our role, we're on kind of a 5-year rotation to do this. So the good news is we'll try it and we'll work on some of those things. And in 5 years, we'll be in this place again, reconfirming both with the community and with our partners, you all at the table, to try to assess where we're at in terms of this work. Anybody have anything else they want to mention in that space, or we'll move on to our other couple reports so we can share some additional information.
Just one last
Yes.
comment about the sense of comfort question. I wonder for vulnerable users, if it sometimes is a false sense of comfort. I'd be interested to see like where people feel comfortable versus where accidents are reduced.
Okay,
Where are the accidents happening?
let's look at the next report.
Yeah, what an excellent transition.
What a great transition.
We also, We also have the safety report was included in the agenda. And so again, kind of, what we do doesn't exist in a bubble, and so we've done a lot of research on safety and kind of those crash statistics as part of the Vision Zero Safety Action Plan that was in development through most of last year and was actually just recently adopted by the City Commission a couple weeks back. Both the resolution to pursue the recommendations and the plan in its entirety. And so I know that some of you have seen that or been involved already, but basically it's a strategic framework to eliminate traffic-related deaths and serious injuries. I think one thing that I do want to highlight in this is all crash data was the safety action plan. And so that created a high injury network, which was again, all users, but then additionally, kind of an overlap onto that was the vulnerable road user high injury network, which is pedestrians, cyclists, as well as construction workers, anyone outside of a automobile. There you go.
So 30% of fatal and serious injury crashes, so we're looking at the most severe, where people are getting injured, of vulnerable road user crashes, and again, this is bike and ped together, have occurred on just 1% of the roadways. So the approach with Vision Zero is if you're trying to drive that number to zero, you can take a very data-driven approach to location improvements that you need to look at and explore in regards to safety. And so this, a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, the City Commission adopted our Vision Zero plan with the commitment to zero for all fatalities and serious injuries by 2050. And there's so both for the whole high injury network and that a Vision Zero network, we'll be looking at implementing projects, policy programs in those spaces around reducing fatal and serious injury crashes.
How does the, so talking about your question, and I think if I heard it right, was how does the level of comfort improvement since the last plan relate to occasions where accidents happened or did not happen since the last plan?
Let us see if we can, and I think to the response of that, let us see if we can overlay our level of comfort.
Yeah.
Or particularly the map where we show improvements since the last plan with crashes and see if what kind of data interaction we're seeing. And I think we can bring something like that back to you that may just be the start of trying to inform that question.
And I was gonna ask how is it prioritized to improve these 1% of roadways versus priority networks where there's gaps? Like how do you interface that?
Yeah, so that'll be something that's recommended in the Vision Zero plan that Aaron's talking about is, we have set this community priority about prioritizing standalone projects for bike ped based on what we call that priority and secondary network. In the spaces where we are trying to complete a network, a system, right? But like the bare bones of a system, our bones of a system. And now, if we also know there are these segments, like in other places where where people are already biking or walking and there's crashes, that there could be some investigation, like if there are bike crashes in those spaces, where is there overlap in those? So we could possibly go back and change our scoring and prioritize those where there are crash histories. Or two, figure out if there also needs to be some other consideration that's adding projects that may not be on the high injury network or not on the priority network, but because they're high injury, they need to be feed into projects. And so I think that's the part you're talking about. I think this plan is going to need, we have some recommendations out of Vision Zero that's recommending changing some things related to complete streets policy and that non-motorized prioritization policy where we're prioritizing the bike and ped projects. And we're going to need to probably evaluate that when we consider if there need to be changes to the priority or secondary network. And we're going to go back out and talk to the public about that, both the priorities and the whole network, to kind of understand then what are their desires in terms of connections in that space. So that's kind of a prelude to what we're looking at for phase 2 of engagement.
I think that question of comfort versus actual safety is very interesting and one that I've wanted to look at and I think it's highlighted in some of the other pieces of the safety plan. The last page here talks about unreported crash types, which is a major issue in cycling. Close calls, minor kind of bumps often don't get reported. And so, but those stories spread. And, everyone that's what we do after a ride is we go, oh, the other day I had this or, and so, the other piece I think was interesting in the safety report as it ties to that is, the road speed of bicycle road crashes, which is on the 4th page, but, talks about the highest percentage, is on 30-mile-an-hour roads, which says that that's where more of those interactions are happening anyway, but also you've got a different mindset when you're riding on those roads, and how does that apply?
Didn't you have statistics? I know this is mostly for Lawrence. Does it cover any of the county, like the 458 where the new bike lanes? I know I live out there, there used to be a lot of crashes and car bike incidents, and with the bike lanes, it seems to me like it's a lot less.
So
Does that help and how?
the
does that
unincorporated part, the part of the county did not participate in our Vision Zero
They didn't.
plan. They chose not to participate. They have separate safety
Separate,
work
that's
that
what I was
they
thinking.
do in relationship to their safety programming. This plan is Lawrence Bikes. But we also do a regional bikeway plan. So when you talk about work and separation, we do that oftentimes parallel or right after we do this planning processes, do all the other 6 cities and the unincorporated parts of the county in terms of bikeway planning. And so I think there's more to be done there. It's not part of this existing.
So I was thinking that I haven't seen that on the map, so I thought it was maybe out of the side of the scope.
Yeah.
And
Thank you.
also related, going back up to page 3 here would be, KDOT is also pursuing, Drive to Zero at the state level. They have rankings that are slightly different than ours. So you can see on the map here, this is the states, and they divide into, different levels of priority. And that is based both on, actual crash data and then, kind of the high risk network. So, higher volume, higher speeds, where they're expecting more crashes, that increases the priority of those places where they are seeing crashes. So they have a little bit different map there, but it does overlap. And that's something to keep an eye on with the grant funding potential, trying to coordinate between our focus and the state's focus to really benefit and advance quicker.
And the benefit of that is they're prioritizing and funding 2 projects that, like bike ped projects under their transportation alternatives program that's funded an extensive amount of safe routes to school gap infill and Lawrence Loop previous projects, that a lot of those projects now have in the scoring, you can get additional money to fund the match portion, and or you can get additional priority in their selection if you're targeting areas where they're high risk or priorities on their vulnerable road user assessment. So that has already benefited us in regards to the Mastery Multimodal Project, which got funded under this work. And in this case, you can see Mastery shows up as one of their higher priority segments. So the good thing about this is they're not only doing it just in word, they're, saying like, here's the data and the results, but they're actually putting their incentive with the resources also. So that is promising in regards to actually driving to zero, is seeing those projects and improvements. So. They all use different date ranges of crashes also, just FYI. So sometimes you will see something and these have to be crashes that involved a motor vehicle.
Right.
So if they were bicycle
Just riding
alone,
off the road or something.
the Kansas Motor Vehicle Accident Report Form isn't used. This is where it's talking about underreported crashes. So there could be a fatality, and there has been in the history of our community where it involved a cyclist in a roadway condition. That's not included in this data set because the data we use that the state and federal government uses is based on those motor vehicle accident report forms. And so I say that, but then also just to tell you, some of these are using 5 years of data, some of them are using 10 years of data. That starts to matter when you talk about improvements of projects, right? Because you can start to say, okay, over 10 years, this may be bad, but 2 years ago, we did a project and we don't have enough data yet to show. We're also behind in the data. So like, for example, they haven't finalized the 2024 data yet. That usually happens in June or July from the previous year. So oftentimes you could be a year or two behind depending on when these analyses are done. So that's just for transparency. There's a lot of nuance in this work also around understanding crash and crash typology. And you can tell a lot of different stories depending on what you're looking at. So we admittedly, we have shown you a lot of different things here.
We do have the crash density included in this as well, and again, you can see the patterns there. We've got similar areas highlighted as the vulnerable road user and a high injury network. And again, downtown, those spaces where vehicles and bikes are often sharing spaces, sometimes at lower speeds, although that block of yellow does tilt a little bit to the west, which is going to be a higher speed than Mass Street itself. Road speed we talked about, and again, you can see, you know, one of the smallest portions, not the smallest, but your 40 and 45 mile an hour roads, I think largely just don't have cyclists on them in the first place. Sometimes.
Or as many.
Or as many, yes. Again, Dan mentioned earlier, the dangers of intersections. We do see quite a few of those accidents happening at controlled intersections. And I think, you know, personal experience and seeing a lot of those right hooks are often an issue. People come up to turn right, they look to make sure the traffic is not coming from the left, and they go. And so that, and then crossings, that number was just for signalized crossings, but there are driveways, there are commercial entrances, things like that as well. Crash narratives, you can kind of see, again, cause of the crash. This is, again, only crashes with motor vehicles. So that certainly influences the number of causes quite a bit as well.
I like that mobile phone is so low.
Yeah, but that's a really hard one to report. And I would say that probably unless they can really prove that, which it's very hard to do, which is why it's hard to enforce, they're not, as law enforcement officers, they're not filling that out as the cause, right? So it may just be general inattention, probably is largely contributed by other things in the vehicle, including.
You can see that large portion there for a right-of-way violation. I think that probably also could stem largely from distraction and not paying attention to your surroundings.
Or not knowing what to do. Like, so there's lack of education on both parties. Nobody knows who has the right of way a lot of the time.
That's a theme overall from the survey that I took away is education is definitely needed. Drivers and cyclists know how to interact with each other.
Great.
So none of these will be, they're just for motor vehicles, so they would include like if there was any bike plus collision. Right?
Correct. Yeah, that would typically be self-reported and wouldn't lead to a crash report necessarily.
Unless
Could
it
lead to a
included
police report.
motor.
Yeah. Yeah, those wouldn't currently be
It's
included.
governed by basically how those are defined in standard traffic ordinance. Right, because the law enforcement has a book, that's the rule book of how they use their forms. And how vehicles are defined, so bicycle with wheel diameter impacts at what point it's considered a vehicle. Adult cyclist.
Do we have any sway over, like with traffic lights, like when you push a light and it says you can cross, but also people coming from the other direction are making a left turn and cross and they're not paying attention to lights? Can we change that light so that that person still has to stop while pedestrians and cyclists are using the.
They're prohibiting like turning movements. when you have
From making
throughput.
right turns,
Yes.
no right
Yeah.
turn on red when.
Yes,
when
those are tools in the toolbox,
Mhm.
although they have a lot of competing interests politically, I think, because if you look at the resident survey that's issued, throughput east and west or across town is some of the highest responses of dissatisfaction in terms of things people want improvements to. And so it's always in conflict with throughput. And so, well, yes, those are options. They're not always, I mean, I think you have to have good causation for crashes in those spaces to kind of justify that. In the pedestrian space, we're working on applying for a Safe Streets and Roads for All grant to do leading pedestrian interval demonstration, which would be push button. If you push the button, you get a go, the pedestrian or user in that space gets a go before cars do, so you get out in advance of that. So that also kind of in that same space can address that, but those are options we can look at in spaces where if we want to go back and look at crashes and make recommendations in those spaces. Trying to think if the Vision Zero thing says anything. Not sure. I have to go back.
May I ask, what survey was throughput identified as a question or?
I think it's called Citizen Satisfaction Survey. It's a statistically valid survey that the city does on regular intervals. You can go find it on the city's website. If you have trouble, email me and I will send it to you.
I've got it, I just didn't,
Okay.
I'm familiar, I just didn't see throughput as anything stated.
Oh, yeah, I think the way it's written is like east-west travel time or connection. It's written in a way that's like, I think, yeah,
It's
it's
inverted.
like in east, west, north, south, yeah, like,
I think it's worth looking at, because I've been hearing that a lot. And when I looked at that document, I didn't, like, when I looked at the question, I didn't necessarily.
well, and we can go look at the one and then the previous one too, because I think there's been a longer term trajectory of that type of comment. And when I say those things, I'm not saying them as like a shut it down. I'm just presenting you with the facts of the other
Right.
things that have been heard in this space. So you're aware that it's not just, it's going to.
I know.
Okay, I just am saying that to you. I
You
know,
know, and
I
they're,
know.
you know, it's, I'm sorry, it's inconvenient.
There are
for you to stop.
particular intersections where
Yes.
that would be a more useful action to deploy.
And I think in those cases, then yes, I think we should talk about those and we should have that as turning restrictions.
Right.
Last page of this document is just, again, those unreported crash types. And this is kind of a thing that we encounter every time that we're doing this type of engagement or trying to gather data. There are quite a few. It breaks down into no contact crashes, which again, I think are very interesting because of the effect that they have on the mental, the psyche of being out on the road, biking, minor bodily injuries, stationary. I took the league certified instructor training and we spent probably an hour on not getting doored and taking the lane and getting that space. But again, I think that's that sense of comfort. You see a car that's not moving, that would be a good place to be. Animal related crashes, work zones, service conditions, criminal or intentional crashes. All of those have an effect on the cycling culture and community, but might not always show up in the statistics when it comes to crash data. I think that goes back to why we ask people about comfort. And it is kind of an interpretive term, but I think that it kind of hits, how do you actually feel out on the road? If we've got any questions about safety, we can review those or.
So we started to put together some additional information in this space related to some of the things we reported as previous performance measures in the plan. Admittedly, we have a little bit of work to do because when we went to explore some of our data around how the data is built in our GIS system, we found some inconsistencies related to marked shared lanes. So some of this may change in relationship to those total bikeway network scores and stuff, but this just gives you a kind of an idea. It's about how that data is tracked, and we need to go back and check the validity of some of it. But this should give you a little bit of an idea over time of kind of where we are in relationship to some of these percentage of bikeways on public streets, high speeds roadways with bike facilities. The actual numbers of bicycle rider fatalities and serious injuries. In that space, which has been under 2 per year. Miles of facility, you can see the big jump there in shared use path. The biggest jump in that space. We work with public health as part of our safe routes to school planning work to look at student reported bike to school percentages. Changing those over time. The last one I think is the most interesting, which is since 2019, this is again our model looking at our level of comfort based on speed and volume, and knowing our goal is 3 or below. You see the big jump from 2019 to 2021 based on the reduction in speeds on residential streets. So that impacted probably the greatest jump in that in some of those spaces for the overall network in terms of comfort, but you can kind of start to see the needle moving in some of those spaces. Miles plan might have increased in that space because as we build stuff, the lines get a little more accurate. So there's a little nuance in that based on how those are built. Anyway, this is kind of all for your information in terms of thinking about how we're tracking stuff. We're committed to tracking outcomes in the plan as we talk about what future goals we will want to have and what we have available to us to track. So.
General question might be basic one, but back on the first document, question on more prevents you from bicycling more. We're kind of alternating some priority between what could appear to be like educational, solve things like careless speeding drivers or aggressive or harassing drivers, maybe for those infrastructure like solution. I wonder what.
We'll start to look at solutions at our next meeting. So we're gonna don't get ahead of yourself, Aaron. He's working on solutions already in this space, right? And I think that's where we tend to be in that space. But I think we're gonna look at all of these things we've heard and know what we know about stuff and bring back to you. Our plan kind of is before that next meeting to bring back to you a list of things that you can help us indicate what you think might be prior. Like we're gonna give you a list of some different things based on education, encouragement, engineering, different things. And then we want to hear from you. One, are we missing anything that you think should be on this list? But 2, it'll be really broad. Like there will be lots of stuff and you're going to try to give us at a high level, like, what do you think are the top priorities up from this list? Right. And then we're going to look at, okay, how priority is it, but then also what's the level of intensity of investment in it? So is it a low hanging fruit or is it a high investment? And we're going to start to build a chart of something that we then I think can show the public to get their feedback on in terms of recommended solutions in this space that we can make recommendations for implementation. Okay. So
thanks. Yeah.
don't get too far. Everybody needed to hear that, but I think we all look at that and you think like, oh, how do I solve this one thing? Well, we're going to look at it in a spectrum and we're going to look at it in terms of what you think are the priorities based on what we heard. We're going to say how intense it is, and then we're going to go ask the community those.
But we want to hear
question.
discuss the data in a meaningful way. And is there a better way or other data that needs to be collected of some sort?
Yes. So if there's something you haven't, so I've heard some questions that have made me make notes to say, like you want to see before and after a bike boulevard. You want to see that the safety stuff, those injuries and the stuff compared to our network or our existing amenities. And I think there's some of those things we can continue to put together to tell the story.
And if I may maybe this also may be premature, but eventually I would like to see what cost estimates are for the
Yeah.
plan that we do come up with. I think that's something that the community can use to move toward implementation
So-
of the plan.
Yes, it will be high level concept probably,
Understood.
because I think the reality of that, and this comes into play because of this. Depending on what level of recommendation we make about infrastructure, right, we may say, okay, this street currently scores a 4 or a 5. Okay, in order to get it to a 3, it would mean this type of facility or this type of facility, which may have, we know now based on the linear foot, what an average cost is for that, and we can calculate something in that space. I don't know if we'll be able to do it for the entire network, but I think we could at least do it for priority and secondary network in that space. But the question then becomes, if you move that target of the goal, it's like, no, you don't want it to be 3 anymore, or the 3, what you call for in that 3 moves in terms of more separation, then there's variables and all of that. So we can do some cost stuff. It will probably be towards the end where we're doing one scenario costing, because it's going to be pretty time intensive, I think, for us to give some sort of estimate in that space, because there are going to be so many, like, for example, okay, good examples. Like if you know this street is gonna say there's a section of street, you know it's gonna need a separated infrastructure. Well, in the current design elements, that leaves you 2 options. That leaves you a cycle track, maybe a protected bikeway, or a shared use path. And we're not gonna know, based on that street or how much right of way and other things, we can make some general guesses probably, but you're just gonna have like incremental costs to say, like, we know a mile in general costs this. For that.
Yeah.
I think that's the level of what we would be able to give you.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the current plan does not have that, because I think there wasn't that much called out, and I think that will be the next elevation of work in this space.
Depending on the existing infrastructure and right of way and there's like, things like, private infrastructure near the right of way, if we need to acquire more right of way, I would say.
Yeah, if you're gonna have to rebuild the roadway now, we gotta go look at every street on Google Street View. We gotta move all the street pole, like, we're gonna have to do some concept level stuff. It's not
in
gonna
conjunction
be.
with other projects,
Yes.
you know. That is in flux every 5 years.
We started talking about that though, like, what are the next things that we can elevate the plan for? And I think there's probably a desire from staff to have more specificity in terms of, like, not just saying, okay, this street is currently this level of comfort, but are you calling for minor separation, major separation, shared street? And then that allows you to get some sort of price range in that space to estimate for your system, but it also gives some indication when we're going in to build project lists that you've already started with a category, kind of before you go into. You can't be too prescriptive, I think, because I think at the system level planning, we also still have an obligation to include individual property owners and neighbors in those spaces when we go in and do additional, like, just from concept to design. There's a need for that, so I think probably those classifications are the best that we're gonna get, where there's like major separation, minor separation, or shared streets in that. But there is a desire to have more specificity in that, which would allow us to do costing that we didn't do in the last plan.
Which leads us to some next steps. We have some flyers out on the table. We are going to do a couple of focus groups coming up in the next few weeks here. We have a downtown parking and then a bikes plus user focus groups. Each of those, we're hosting 3 small group sessions for each topic. There is some information on the questions that we'll be asking. The flyers are here on the table as well as included in that. So if you have any questions, feel free to let us know or look those over. And then also, if you know people who live downtown and want to voice their opinions on parking, or if they ride an e-bike or scooter or things like that, connect them with this focus group opportunity. And then I think we've already talked a little bit about what those next phases are going to be as far as some of those recommendations, but we're also going to be looking into the network. And so questions around the priority and secondary networks, any spaces that people would like to add, change, kind of rank differently, We're working through our GIS capabilities and Survey 123, which is the same platform we used for the first one, to see what the best way to implement those questions will be. It's a powerful but somewhat complicated tool some days. Some days it does exactly what we want, and some days it doesn't. And so we've been working on developing that next phase of engagement, which will include a survey for the public. We'll have another open house. And
We'll be able to tell you more about it at the next meeting, because we're having one more meeting with you before we go and do that work for phase 2, of course. In the late summer or late fall timeframe. And so, you know, we'll be back with you to bring you this other stuff you've asked for. Part of the recommendations as we build start of the best practices, our internal staff review of best practices and recommended strategies kind of for all these things. So you can help us frame what we're presenting to the public in that next round, kind of in relationship to all of these things. So. Okay, we put a lot on you. Is there any questions or is there any other discussion about things you'd like to talk about in this space in relationship to these next steps or anything? If you think of something after you read something again, or you go look at something, you can email us. We'll be happy to, you know, if you think of something else you'd like to see, we can let you know if we have it and we can bring it, and we'll continue to work in this space. You know, we're at the place right now where we're giving you lots of stuff. We're going to give you lots of stuff for the next thing too. We're going to ask some feedback from you. We'll send you a survey to fill out beforehand so we can present the results of that here and show kind of where everybody's that the priorities were to start the discussion about some of those recommendations in that space before we go out to the public kind of with that next phase. And admittedly, that next phase of engagement is going to be a little, people are going to have to consume some, like the first thing they can just tell us, how do you experience this and how do you feel? The next stage of engagement, they're going to have to consume a little bit to be able to respond to it. And so it will, like, we may not get as many people, we may get, you know, different people that didn't include in the first one, and we'll kind of have to navigate that together. And maybe you can inform and work to share information you have with people in your networks to help us continue to get engagement in this process as we work to write our new bike plan. That's all we have for you, so unless anybody has anything else.
A lot of work you guys do.
Thank you. Yeah. So if you haven't participated in an NPO planning process, this is what it looks like. This is what we do. For those of you that have participated with us before, you've probably seen some of these things before, but we're committed to transparency in our survey sharing and in the work to really hopefully you can help feel like you're guiding this plan, that by the time we're done with it, it's as much of your plan as it is our plan. So we appreciate your time and commitment in that too.
We done?
We're done. Unless nobody has anything else, we're done.
you don't have to make.
We'll keep your name tags to help you for us for next time.